Awesome. So hello, everyone, and welcome. As other people join us, I'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Maria. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate in psychological sciences and one of the graduate student researchers in the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And I was privileged enough to be able to be the lead on our Free Speech Week development. So I'm very excited to have you all join us today. And I'd like to officially welcome you all to today's session and let you all know that today's event, along with the other events of Free Speech Week, are really possible due to the funding that was provided very generously by the University of California National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. So thank you to that funding source. I also wanted to let you all know that today's session is being recorded because we're going to make it available on our website after the end of Free Speech Week as a resource for everybody who's attending and anybody who may have missed any of the really helpful and important information that our fantastic guest speaker, Mr. Jonathan Friedman, is going to be sharing with us today. So before we start with our presentations and before I give it over, hand it over to my colleague Onar, I'd like to first ground our work in all of the information that we're going to be presenting today in the land and labor acknowledgement and reflections. So local indigenous people, including the Yukuts and Miwok, who understood the earth as a place for everyone, first inhabited the land where UC Merced is located. When we address diversity on this campus, we do so boldly, daring to look forward and backward, imagining diversity's demand for the 21st century and the importance of diversity in addressing past wrongs, reaffirming humanity, and ensuring a reconciliatory path of redress for the future. The most prominent path on our campus is called Scholars Lane, and by day, when we were in person, you can see, hear, and witness the embodiment of our diversity throughout campus, through our campus community, members making their way across campus, framed by the slopes and the peaks of the Sierra Nevada. So while this may be a little bit different when we were in person as opposed to our virtual spaces, we invite you to really reflect as we present the information in this presentation and just throughout the week and in your future endeavors to really reflect on, what our intentions do you have to disrupt and dismantle colonialism beyond this land acknowledgement? What is your organization or unit or department doing beyond acknowledging those whose land and labor allow you to live, work, and or learn in this space? And with that, I'll go ahead and introduce my colleague, Ornar Primitivo, to provide some information about our community agreements for today's presentation. Thank you again for joining us. Ornar?
Great, thank you, Maria. And similar to our previous events, these are our community agreements that we value. And as you join us in this space, we are agreeing to these community agreements so we can have a very vibrant conversation after the presentation, so that we agree to speak for ourselves and allow others to speak for themselves with no pressure or to represent or explain to the whole group. Again, just really owning our stories and using I statements. We agree to listen with resilience and hanging in when something is hard to hear, right? So grappling with multiple perspectives, striving for intellectual humility. We agree to consider asking questions to check out our assumptions we are making rather than taking that assumption as fact. We agree to share airtime and participate with the suggested time frame. We agree to pass or pass for now if we're not ready or willing to respond to a question. So Jonathan will provide some prompts and the chat will be open. We'll be monitoring that. So we want to make sure we capture your comments and questions. We agree that when we discuss our experience with people who are not present, we will not attach names or other identifying information unless we have permission to do so. So asking that individual consent. And then we agree to this is a space of learning, recognizing that no one, including the presenter, is able to know all things. We are all in the process of learning. And again, want to put the challenge out there that, identify where your learning edge is and push it. For example, whenever you think I already know this stuff, ask yourself, how can I take this deeper? Or how am I applying in practice what I already know? So with that, I will introduce our guest speaker. Where's my, sorry. Okay, so Jonathan Freeman is the director of free expression and education at PEN America, where he oversees PEN America's advocacy, analysis, and outreach in the international debate around free speech and inclusion in higher education. He serves as the lead author of PEN America's 2019 report, Chasm in the Classroom, Campus Free Speech in a Divided America, and on the production of its digital campus free speech guide. Jonathan holds a PhD in international education from New York University and previously taught courses at NYU and Columbia University in comparative and international education, higher education, and social theory. His research on American and international higher education has been published in leading academic journals, and he regularly provides commentary on campus free speech issues, campus free speech issues for the national news media. He has previously received awards for his teaching, research, and leadership. And again, round of applause to our speaker, Jonathan Freeman. Welcome.
Thank you, Onar and Maria and Danya and everyone else behind this wonderful week of events. I am really delighted to be here to speak with you all today about these issues of free speech in our everyday life. And I will say right off the bat, I love to talk about this topic because it's so interesting, it's so rich, and there are so many different ways that we can talk about free speech. You know, it's a complicated topic with a very rich history. So what I'm going to be presenting today, I thought, I always, my training as a historian and a sociologist means that I like to think with a lot of fragments of the past, moments, a kind of openness to thinking about what trends we see when we look across time. And so I'm going to be looking a little bit back at the history of free speech and thinking about the politics of free speech today and how it manifests in everyday life for everyone, for young people, for students, faculty, and administrators. I'm going to move in the end of the conversation to, in the end of my remarks, to talking about campuses and to talking about tips or ways in which we can all support free speech and think about free speech as a more nuanced topic. And in particular, thinking about the issue of free speech from the lens of social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I want to start by saying that there's no question that if any of you were to scan the politics of the news right now and of the past few years, and you asked who are the champions of free speech right now in the United States, there's no question that they lie on the conservative side of the political spectrum. Donald Trump, when he was president, consistently turned to the issue of free speech on campus as something that would rile up his base. We've seen Republican legislators across the country attempt to pass, or sometimes successfully pass, new laws protecting free speech on campus. And beyond that, there has been a general conversation around free speech on social media, free speech and censorship in the cultural arts, questions of cancel culture all swirling around. And what I want to start with is actually by asking us to hold the present and the present in our kind of lens and our knowledge of free speech, just put it in a little drawer for a minute as we turn to kind of thinking about history and the history of where this concept comes from. And some of you may be surprised to learn that this is not how free speech used to be viewed. And in fact, many people from the past would view those political dynamics today and be quite surprised. So we're going to go a little back and think about the long-term fight for social justice, equity, or social change. Now, as I said, I'm going to talk through fragments of history. I think these are very enlightening and illuminating when we think about and we want to understand what's going on today. What you're seeing here is a pamphlet, a printed pamphlet that was created in 1788 in Britain, but became widely circulated in France, Britain, and the United States, and it was known as anti-slavery propaganda. Okay, this was propaganda created by groups of individuals, citizens, who were concerned about the state of slavery, legal slavery, or what was called the regulated slave trade in the 18th century. And it was known at the time as an extremely powerful image precisely because it showed a slave ship, the Brooks, and the number of slaves to be taken from West Africa to parts of the British Empire, including the United States, and showed exactly how many bodies might fit on the ship. And what was really ingenious about this as a work of art, as a work of political art, and as an effort at social change was the way in which it depicted just how intolerable and inhumane the living conditions must be on these boats. Now, I don't want to get too deep into the history of the slave trade, but I want you to think about for a minute that this, when it was created, was an incendiary piece of propaganda. It was an image that many people attribute to bringing about the end of the slave trade, among many others. And those who fought for abolition, including Frederick Douglass in the US and other allies in Europe, used images like this, used printed pamphlets, and they used what we today would consider free speech. That might surprise you to think about that issue and that history that way, but it's far from the only incident. In fact, in the 1910s, in New York City in particular, free speech was all the rage, in particular among feminists, women of different classes who congregated around Greenwich Village in groups and would get together in mass meetings to try and convince one another and other people that feminism and change, social change, equality for women was not so radical an idea whatsoever. Now, this handbill, which was circulated for a feminist mass meeting in 1914, doesn't say the words free speech. But I can tell you that many of the people who attended this had other meetings and belonged to some of them what were called free speech clubs, where they would get together and talk to each other about ideas that they felt they could not express elsewhere. Ideas, if you look at the bottom of the page at the second feminist meeting, some of the ideas that were considered radical, that they required free speech in order to say aloud and share publicly, ideas like the right to work for women, the right of the mother to her profession, the right to her convictions, the right to her name, the right to organize, the right to ignore fashion, that's always a fun one, and the right to specialize in home industries. And maybe a little bit less, maybe less interesting than ignoring fashion. But I want you to just think for a minute, put yourself in the position of people nearly 100 years ago who felt that they were very much not equal in society, that they wanted social change. And not only did they try to press for that through kind of mass meetings and public presentations, they actively were the groups who were responsible for defending and articulating the importance of free speech. Now, they weren't, acting alone. They weren't kind of acting in a bubble. Always in these different moments, these and other historical moments in the past, century and before, they're often operating against what you might think of as strong repressive regimes of censorship. In fact, in 1873, there was a set of laws passed in the United States called the Comstock Laws, named for a gentleman named Anthony Comstock, who saw it as his personal mission. He had this he was an evangelical, and he wanted to ensure that the United States remained a strongly Christian society. And he founded and led something that was called the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. And he had permission under the Comstock Laws to check anything that was sent in the mail and essentially order people be arrested, jailed for poetry, nude photographs of women in illicit poses. He got Mae West, who was a Broadway actress, thrown in jail for 10 days for her Broadway play with the provocative title in 1927, Sex. Now, today, these episodes, and we look at like the Comstock Laws, and we think about efforts to suppress poetry and other forms of creative expression in the creative arts, we look at them and we think, we know instinctively how far the country has come or how much progress has been made, how much freer these things are now. But in order to understand the history of free speech, we have to understand the history of the ways in which that speech was suppressed. In 1919, Emma Goldman was an anarchist feminist. She was part of many of these feminist movements. She was deported, and she was deported back to Russia, even though she had lived in the United States most of her life, because of her advocacy for anarchism and revolution. She was incensed when she was deported. And I'm going to read her words at her federal hearing on her deportation in 1919. She said, "Every human being is entitled to hold any opinion that appeals to her or him without making herself or himself liable to persecution. Ever since I have been in this country, and I have lived here practically all my life, it has been dinned into my ears that under the institutions of this alleged democracy, one is entirely free to think and feel as he pleases." What becomes of this sacred guarantee of freedom of thought and conscience when persons are being persecuted and driven out for the very motives and purposes for which the pioneers who built up this country laid down their lives? You could see in her commentary here a scathing rebuke of the United States' claims to uphold democracy, free speech, and her sort of living example of someone who was engaging in radical thought and ideas and was being persecuted, punished for it. And in fact, she and many other people were. Here, we fast forward 1964, protests break out at the University of California. And I chose this one because it's kind of locally relevant for you, for this audience. This is a letter to the University of California from John Lewis, who at the time was the head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And he was writing the University of California, asking them to uphold the rights of his brothers and sisters in their fight for full free speech at the university campus. In particular, this has to do with brutality from police towards protesting students, and his effort and others to uphold the rights of students to engage in anti-war protests or calls at the time, what we might think of as social change. So there's no history of censorship from these groups. Now, this doesn't mean that these calls always win. John Lewis, Emma Goldman, there are many instances in which people on the left or pushing for social justice have requested that the rights of free speech be upheld. And sometimes they succeed and sometimes they don't. One example in which it failed, efforts to support the academic freedom of a radical professor at UCLA in 1969, Angela Davis, who was essentially fired for her communist beliefs. But fast forward half a century, and in 1995, in a case that went to the Supreme Court, Hurley v. Irish American Gay, Lesbian, and Bisexual Group of Boston, we see a group of LGBTQ individuals who successfully file suit and win for their right to march, essentially in a parade in Boston with their LGBTQ identities publicly known. So even though the larger group at the core of this conflict was the question of whether, if the group as a whole didn't support this subgroup's claim to LGBTQ rights, could they suppress them? Could they prevent them from marching with such a banner? And those groups won. And it's not the only time. In fact, there are a series of cases which center on gay pride parades and the rights to free speech, free expression, public assembly, in which the cause for social justice has been advanced by free speech. So here's some history, and here's some fragments. And a lot of the times right now, we think and talk about free speech through a very narrow aperture, just relevant to the current Trump administration or the past 4 years. But it's very important to think about, and for those who talk and think in the realm of free speech and its history, thinking about the long-term history of these issues, thinking of the long-term implications of the decisions that were made in the past. And throughout the 20th century, decisions were taken time and again to protect free speech, precisely because the Supreme Court and its justices were concerned about how they might make decisions that would have an implication on free speech cases in the future. And consistently, they wanted to be very cautious around how they would impede on free speech so as not to be perceived as infringing on this notion of the marketplace of ideas, of free speech for all, etc. So how does this feed into things that we're seeing right now and things that we're seeing today? There's no question that the threats to free speech as a cause and an effort to advance social justice continue. Even just this week, Republican senators in Tennessee wrote a letter to the public colleges in the state telling them to stop athletes from kneeling during the national anthem. They actually wrote that when students at the University of Tennessee don jerseys, they are ambassadors for the university, they're ambassadors for the state, and they must be prohibited from kneeling or penalized for doing so. Now, there's no question everybody recognizes student athletes kneeling are kneeling for racial justice. They are following the lead of Colin Kaepernick. We understand this is a protest, an act of protest against police and over issues of race. And there's no question that the senators who are doing this are ignoring that history of free speech, ignoring the importance or the ways in which they might in other moments uphold free speech, and kind of purposefully not seeing this issue, this instance, this act of protest for social justice as something that deserves free speech protections. But that's all the more reason that they do. And you can see, right, this long history of efforts for the past 100 years of people who want to engage in social change, who are using speech to do so, expressive forms, a variety of engaging in a variety of expressive forms, and having governmental or other authorities try to impede them. What about here? In a number of states, this is another one from the past few weeks, there is currently, right now, today, in 2021, legislation in multiple states in the US to punish schools, to defund schools, or not necessarily defund them fully, but essentially the laws suggest that schools that want to use curriculum from the 1619 Project, itself a project to look and reevaluate the history of race and racism in the United States since 1619. There is an effort by Republican state lawmakers to say that however much it costs to engage in that curriculum, we will subtract those costs from schools. So if a school curriculum costs, I don't know, $10,000, whatever teaching time is used to do that, the state and the public won't pay for it. And of course, once again, what we're seeing is free speech from those who are engaged in the 1619 Project and others, from teachers, from students, from parents who want to engage in difficult history, hard history, and an effort to prevent that, an effort to stop those who want to explore those difficult issues in schools by those who don't see it as an issue of free speech, but are not afraid to try and censor it, to try and suppress it. Now, I'll give you a hint. If you look at the past 100 years, you'll also find, if you think for just a minute about all the efforts 100 years ago to suppress free speech, to suppress social change, to suppress, women and minorities and the LGBTQ population, the story of the past 100 years is essentially one of triumph of those groups. It's the lesson that that kind of censorship doesn't really work. And I suspect that it won't really work in these cases either. How do I know? Here in the fall, the Trump administration put out an executive order trying to prevent diversity trainings on college campuses by other federal agents. It was not the best worded in the sense that it was deliberately somewhat vague in terms of its implications for higher education, but we saw a wave of colleges canceling diversity programs and other federal agents and agencies concerned about how they might spend money and what penalties might result for doing it. So it had what we call a chilling effect on many discussions of race, racism, equity, inclusion, diversity. And it wasn't long before the NAACP and other groups sued the Trump administration, and they effectively won, although now during the Biden administration, and it doesn't essentially matter, but it could have mattered, and they did win. They said, this is an affront, this is an attack, this is a violation, an infringement on free speech. So they were, again, able to use the laws that protect free speech in the United States to push back against this effort to censor. Similarly, in Georgia, a few years ago, a cheerleader, a Black woman cheerleader who kneeled during the anthem, sued the university after she was removed from the team and prevented from cheerleading, and she won the settlement, right? She said, you violated my First Amendment, my free speech rights, and I'm able to pursue damages for it, and she won that case. So you can see the power, all right, in all of these instances. That doesn't always work out. It hasn't always been properly upheld, but certainly as its evolution over time is such that today you can pretty much, in many cases, hope that the arc of history, that the pressure of history, the pressure of precedent means that in many cases in which social justice is looking to be achieved through speech, that free speech in this country will help it and help it go forward. So what's the problem then with free speech? It seems so great. It seems like there's no problem with free speech. We have no issues. Why are we even spending all week talking about it? Why is the country so bent over talking about free speech? Well, the problem is that because free speech is often conceived as a somewhat neutral idea. So while it protects social justice and has been an ally to social justice, much in the ways that I've talked about so far, well, there's also a recognition that it kind of isn't the whole story. In fact, this is from a newspaper article in the New York Times from October last year, questioning what we might call is like the marketplace of ideas. And is that really a fair market, an equal marketplace? Jason Stanley and David Beaver are quoted in this article with this quote, which is a very interesting one to consider. They say, free speech threatens democracy as much as it also provides for its flourishing. Now, what are they talking about there? Free speech threatens democracy as much as it also provides for its flourishing. What do you think they're talking about? If you have ideas, please put them in the chat. What does that mean to you? What do you immediately think they're talking about when they say free speech could be threatening, a problem for democracy? So far, what I've talked about is how free speech is an asset to democracy, the importance of free speech for social change. So what do we talk about when we talk about how it's a threat? Hate speech. Absolutely. What else? It's been in the news a lot lately. Alternative facts. Yeah, a nice way of saying misinformation, disinformation, or fabricated news, right? Falsehoods. The incitement to lawless action, incitement of violence, right? So free speech as a concept doesn't protect all forms of expression of all kinds. Certainly the First Amendment has many exceptions to the ways in which it is applied to speech. But we do recognize that just as free speech protects my demands to call for change or for equity or to march, so does it protect the demands of others who might march or march against me, or who march questioning my humanity, or who want to impose their views on the rest of society. This isn't actually that new either, although it's certainly been an issue that's gotten a lot of attention right now. In the 1970s, these kinds of questions came to a head in a famous case in Skokie, Illinois, where a group of neo-Nazis, American neo-Nazis, wanted permission from the city to have a parade. They wanted to have an assembly, a peaceful parade in town. And just like, as I mentioned before, the LGBTQ community used the First Amendment and used the courts to insist that they have equal rights, right? The rights to engage in what today we would call gay pride parades and other celebrations. So too did ultimately courts find that neo-Nazis too had those rights. And the concern was not to infringe upon people's freedom of assembly based on the content of what it is they want to promote. That the way in which those laws have been and those decisions have been handed down is such that a kind of caution that if we get into the business of giving permits to different groups, allowing them to speak based on whether we like what they have to say, then the we there gets a great deal of power, right? Whoever is in power has a great deal of power to determine it. And so this was, you see these days sometimes neo-Nazi and other hateful extremist groups marching under the banner of free speech. This image from 40 years ago shows that's not a new challenge. And in fact, we have to really seriously look at hate and the way that hate has spread, certainly under President Trump and in the past 4 years. Hate has been a major issue in the United States. There are reports of hate in the past 4 years, unlike anything from the past 10 or 20 years before that, in which in classrooms, in schools, university campuses in particular, there is huge spike in reports. Now, some people say, well, we're just reporting it and we're tracking it much better. Other people say, no, everyone's just gotten too sensitive. And so what it is that we say or report as a hateful incident, well, it's not terribly objective criteria. And so sometimes that is reflected in this. But regardless, what we could say is certainly there are incidents that many people feel are hateful, or many incidences in which people feel excluded, marginalized, bullied based on their identity in a number of institutional spaces. And there's a lot of real difficult issues here. And so if we, though the history of free speech and the power of free speech for social change is important, we have to kind of balance that and hold that in our heads alongside these challenges, the ways in which free speech can undermine or diminish democracy. I mean, can you really think about free speech without considering power dynamics? Who has the power and access to platforms to give voice to their views? Who has the history of using words to inflict pain and suffering and repression on other groups? And those words still exist, those concepts still exist. And so is there some way to recognize, on one hand, that even though people can say lots of things, it doesn't mean that those things don't have harms, that there isn't a burden on all of us to create a society in which we're being more respectful with one another with our words. This is my point, that the legality of speech never, right? It can be perfectly legal to say something, even if it's, protected speech by the First Amendment, but that doesn't preclude the responsibility and the opportunity for institutional actors, for friends, for allies, for teachers, for parents, for other community leaders to effect empathetic responses, regardless of whether they think you or someone else should have been harmed by something that was said. It's what I call a duty of care, a duty of responsibility. So we often talk about free speech is necessary for democracy, the rights of people to engage in this marketplace of ideas, but we can balance that with also recognizing the importance of citizens to also engage in empathy and inclusion, right? The concepts aren't at odds with each other. They actually go very much hand in hand. I'm going to skip through this, but if some of you or just want to reference it for quick interest, if you're interested in thinking about what sometimes is called bystander intervention, the group Hollaback has their 5Ds, which are fantastic. And these are tips for situations in which someone is being attacked, right? Attacked with speech. Doesn't mean just because it's free speech or just because it's legal speech that there aren't things that people can do in response. Similarly, we can engage in using free speech to fight hate. This is the key point of Nadine Strawson, former director of the ACLU. She writes, the most effective ways to counter the potential negative effects of hate speech is not through censorship, but rather through more speech. That censorship of hate speech, no matter how well intended, has been shown around the world and throughout history to do more harm than good in actually promoting equality, dignity, inclusivity, diversity, and societal harmony. Indeed, what she's talking about is that once you start to empower governments with the ability to police speech or to have laws that they can use to fight and stop, censor hate speech, you have to really think carefully about who might having that power. My good example of this is the phrase Black Lives Matter. We might see Black Lives Matter as very important to achieving the cause of social justice in the United States. However, for President Donald Trump, Black Lives Matter, he called it hate speech when it was painted on Fifth Avenue in New York City. And so if he had more power to censor, more power to stop speech, you can almost be certain that he would have exercised that power in ways that I'm sure current President Joe Biden would not. The trick is to recognize that even though depriving government of that power means that government can do less in the face of hate, can do less in the face of misinformation, and citizens have to do more. What it does is it deprives future governments or other authorities from having that power as well. Now, what about other forms of counter speech? What can we do in the face of hate? What can citizens do? Well, I mentioned a minute ago counter speech. You can also organize and engage in counter protest, more speech. You can ignore speech that you don't like or find offensive. But one other way to use is satire. In a classic example from Germany, there was a town that neo-Nazis used to march in every year because it was the birthplace of a famous Nazi named Rudolf Hess. And one year, after many years of protests and trying to stop this, the citizens said, what if we tried something new? And they held a fundraiser that essentially treated the arriving neo-Nazis like a walkathon. And rather than encouraging them to leave, they encouraged them to come. They kind of cheered them on for walking further. And they said, every mile that you walk, we're going to donate more money to the group that fights extremism in the country. And it kind of creates this paradox for those who are wanting to come and engage in this hateful speech, where suddenly what is a parade but an exercise of power, a demonstration of power in an effort to intimidate, and suddenly the politics, right? By politics, I mean the power relationships of the whole dynamic flipped on their head and they changed. So there are ways in which we can respond to incidents of hate or respond to speech we don't like that don't involve empowering other authorities to do it by basically taking the responsibility as citizens. This is an example from Middlebury College 2 years ago, where a Polish politician, very conservative and known for having homophobic remarks, was scheduled to come to the campus. And some of you might know that Middlebury had been the site of a protest that many people felt had gotten, violent, out of control a few years earlier. And a group of students wanted to protest his arrival. But in particular, they were sensitive to the fact that they not shut down, deplatform, prevent him from speaking. And so what they did was they signed an agreement as a group of organizers on campus, that they would get together and stage a kind of celebration of LGBTQ identity outside the auditorium where he was supposed to be speaking. And they talked about it as a queer pride celebration, a kind of dance off. There was going to be music and bright colors, and really affirmatively showing off and kind of living in and expressing, right, engaging in a kind of celebratory expression of their identities. The college leaders canceled the event before it happened, and they claimed security concerns. And it was very quick that national media picked up the story, and the students were blamed for canceling it. And at the time, I said to somebody, well, how can you blame these student protesters for interrupting an event if the event never started, right? How is it fair to blame them? And in fact, you can't. The students had the same idea. They wrote an op-ed and they demanded that the college leaders be clear and communicate that the event was not canceled because of the students. And in fact, they actually criticized the college administration and said that not only had the administration deprived the speaker of the opportunity to speak and the audience who wanted to be there from hearing him, they deprived them of the opportunity to have their counter protest heard, paid attention to. And it's a very, again, if you think about the ways in which the power dynamics surrounding these events unfold, it was a way in which they were able to demonstrate what their opinion was without infringing on other people's rights to speak in that circumstance. So, how do we make sense of this? Does free speech threaten democracy as much as it provides for its flourishing? On the one hand, you can say, absolutely it does. It's a huge threat, because we have free speech. It allows hate to spread. It allows misinformation to spread easily. It's much harder to put a check on those things. And so, therefore, we should hem in free speech in some ways. But the danger in this line of thinking, and the danger really even in the quote, is that it implies that the answer should be to somehow stop free speech, which of course we cannot do, not only legally and precedent-wise, but because of the ways in which social justice requires free speech to be advanced. If you think about it inherently, the cause and push for change, for social change, relies on the ability of those what seem like radical ideas to be heard. Defund the police, legalize DACA, and abolish ICE. These are, if you think of progressive social change slogans, if we didn't have free speech, it would be much, much easier to quash them, to stop them. And the other thing is that we could swab into this quote, that free speech threatens democracy as much as it provides for its flourishing. Well, what if we put in the word literacy? Literacy, education, public schooling. Public schooling threatens democracy as much as it provides flourishing. Well, it certainly does. When you go to public school, you learn radical ideas. You learn revolutionary history. You learn to read and write, and those are really dangerous skills. They are, right, on the whole. But of course, nobody really believes that. And we have all come around to seeing the importance of public education, the importance of literacy. We know that there's inequality in those realms, and we fight to change that inequality. But nobody would say that that inequality means we should take those things away. I would say I view it as a similar issue around free speech, which is there is inequality right now. There's inequality in access to and misunderstanding surrounding free speech and free speech rights. And in part, why we are seeing this effort to stop free speech when it is used in the cause of social justice is in part because there is no national groundswell demanding that it not be done. We don't see right now the whole country talking about, we didn't see it with Kaepernick and we don't see it now with these student athletes in Tennessee, with everyone saying, hold on a minute, you're infringing on free speech. And the power of that argument is very significant in a way that no other argument quite rivals it. And so I would hate to lose that argument, lose that powerful argument as something that everyone could recognize that, well, we might disagree with what these students are kneeling for, but we can recognize their fundamental rights to do it, even if the rest of us, the majority or minority, disagrees with it. What about in our everyday lives then? It's a philosophy that I think of as free speech for all. I want to signify here, in using the phrase for all, that the work of free speech, much like the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, is unfinished and that it requires work. It's not, to promote free speech and to promote free speech for social change or social justice doesn't happen on its own. It requires citizens, and in a few different ways. One, it requires that people carve out a space for dissent, even when it is difficult, giving the benefit of the doubt to their interlocutors. What this means is that thinking about, in all situations, even right now, let's say with misinformation surrounding the vaccine, someone who's an anti-vaxxer, who believes that their family should not get the vaccine. We have to be careful about thinking that those ideas should have no room to circulate whatsoever, because suffocating that counter speech could ultimately be the precedent that suffocates a different form of counter speech in the future. I know that's a difficult one, and I even pause and hesitate around it myself. But I do think that there is always a concern about the ways in which even cases of public health could have significant ramifications in the future. What about when people are offended, when students or citizens are upset? What can they do? I think it's very important with the debate around cancel culture, for example, to remember that most people who are calling for boycotts or who are calling for some product to be removed or some person to be removed are themselves exercising free speech. They are exercising their right. So we have to be very careful in saying, oh, well, don't call for that, or you shouldn't call for that. I put the onus more on institutions who have faced great pressure to buckle to those demands and have to be careful about thinking through, well, what happens with institutional precedents? For example, in a police department in Massachusetts, there was a wave of calls to dismiss a police officer last year who had liked an image or shared an image from someone in her family's Instagram that was against Blue Lives. It was an anti-police, defund police message, and she was dismissed for being a police officer engaging in what was viewed as political speech. But the rationale given for dismissing her by the police chief was that 2 years earlier, he had fired a more conservative police officer who had seemed to be in support of the marchers in Charlottesville in Virginia. And so what he felt was that since one group had been so offended by one police officer's political views, and they made a rule that police officers knew they couldn't share on social media their such political views, that they couldn't make an exception for the second one, that they kind of had to be fair and even-handed. You can debate, you can disagree with it, but it's the way in which institutional thinking takes over. Once we've started to censor, I wouldn't be surprised. In a similar example, we've seen a lot of universities take great lengths to intervene involving students' social media posts that are deemed racist and sexist, transphobic, what have you. And I do think there is much that universities have to do in those cases. I think it's a significant concern. But here's the concern, that after the wave of current social media posts for which students are being penalized, what happens when there's a student who is criticizing the university or criticizing the current president or speaking in, and I don't just mean criticizing, I mean using, vulgar or offensive language to criticize something patriotic. And a group of people says, well, you have a rule at the university that when people engage in such vitriol on social media, you'll take action. The university will be pressured to take action, or alternatively, they might find it easier to take action based on what they've done in the past. So what does this all amount to? It means, where possible, call in before calling out. That doesn't work in every situation, and I'm happy to talk about more situations where I think it can work. But if it's possible, try to tell someone what's harmful or what's offended you. Bring a friend to a confrontation. But once you turn to kind of the public comments calling for institutional reprisals, the stakes of the situation change significantly. Finally, right, what can we do to support free speech? Well, you can't, I believe, support free speech without taking proactive steps to dispel hate, to encourage media literacy, to train citizens, to educate people about free speech and about their rights and all people equally, and practicing allyship when someone is harmed, offended, attacked. is the receiving end of vitriol, especially attacking their identity. What I mean by this is that the marketplace of ideas actually requires us not just to support it in an abstract, neutral sense, but if we want to bring about the cause of social justice and social change, that we have to support and take active measures in that marketplace at the same time. In other words, if we're really going to support free speech, that we have to support it with supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is the theme that animates much of our advice and our work at PEN America. And if you'd like to check it out, you can find it on our campus free speech guide at .pen.org. That's the URL. You can find there principled and practical advice for a range of situations. And we've really tried to break it down, looking at situations related to academic freedom or invited speakers or hate on campus or protests. And you can see here an example of what we say to do. You know, if a professor has said something that offended you in class, what are some steps that you can take? And the first one, for example, is to pause, you know, to really consider it. You know, sit with, you know, think about the feelings and process them before you take significant steps to demand for, I don't know, their dismissal. What about if you find hateful messages on campus? We have steps that we've outlined here for what you can do and what we think you can do. And again, owing to our belief that to support a campus or a society in which we have free speech, we have to be taking these steps to fight hate. We have thoughts also about what institutions can do on that site in response to certain situations to support free speech, to support DEI. And you can find more of the ideas on that campus free speech guide as well. I'm going to pause here and just kind of thank everyone for listening and open it up to questions about free speech. You know, it's not, as I said at the beginning, it's a complicated issue, and there's a lot of nuance in this history. Maria, do you want me to just call on people for questions and they can unmute?
Yeah, I was just about to put that in the chat for people to put any questions that they have in their chat or to raise their hand. So I can go ahead. I didn't see which hand rose first. So I don't know if you saw which one was.
The first one I saw was Sean Malloy, it looks like.
Yeah, so Sean, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Great, thank you so much. And thank you for your talk today. It was very, very engaging. So one of the arguments I heard you make today, and I've heard in other venues against content-based restrictions on hate speech, is that not only are they ineffective, but that invariably they might be abused and could be turned against progressive causes, and ultimately would hinder that. It seems to me we do have a kind of, we don't have to talk about this in the abstract, because there are countries in Western Europe, most notably Germany, but there are other countries that do have such content-based restrictions on hate speech. Germany, particularly with speech around Nazism. And I'm obviously not an expert on this, but it doesn't seem like those laws have prevented Germans from having vocal discussions about progressive issues. It doesn't seem like it's led Germany to fall into tyranny. How would you discuss the examples of European countries that have tried content-based restrictions that we haven't tried here?
Sure. I'll give a few examples. In France, there's a case where somebody was using slurs, anti-gay slurs, and in response, let's say person A is using the slur. In response, person B says, "You're being homophobic." Okay. Now, in the US, you could say that. Why couldn't you? But in France, there's actually a case where, as a result of such an exchange, the person who was ultimately fined was not person A, but person B. That calling someone homophobic, okay, was found by the judges and the authorities to be a form of hateful or insulting speech that is considered not allowed. In fact, also in France, it is illegal currently to criticize the flag, to criticize the police in certain spaces, to criticize the institutions of government, things that here in the US people take absolutely for granted as free speech. In France, it's actually illegal. You would have in France right now, take the example of the kneeling basketball players, you would have a much stronger case in France for finding those students guilty of breaking laws for disrespecting that national institution. Now in Germany, tremendous amount of effort has gone into stomping neo-Nazis in Germany. And on the whole, I would say that today it's being demonstrably shown that much of it has been extremely ineffective. For example, you cannot say the German word for swastika on a t-shirt. You cannot write, I'm going to mispronounce it, but it's something like Hakenkreuz. You can't put that on a t-shirt. But it was found that you can write the word swastika. So effectively, the efforts to ban and silence speech make the playfulness around breaking those rules more attractive. You can't say Heil Hitler in certain places, but nobody will stop you from writing the number 88. And to those who know, they know that 2 8s means HH means Heil Hitler. And there's actually a whole flourishing of underground symbols, and even now symbols on there's like cool hip clothing in Germany today, much of it peddling old Nazi symbols and neo-Nazi imagery for those who know what it really means. You know, an image of an airplane in a desert, for example, and how that somehow is a reference to neo-Nazis. I don't know exactly, but it is to those who know. And so what ends up happening when you try to censor this way is it just goes underground. Actually, in the United States, arguably, it's much easier if you think about right now trying to fight white supremacy. It's never easy to fight white supremacy, but think about the difference between authorities trying to fight that where speech has been censored and coded and hidden versus it's pretty obvious and we all can see it. That doesn't mean that police are actually taking always here in the US in the past few years enough actions or the right actions to fight it, but just think about the ways in which that happens. Now, it's true, these countries haven't fallen into tyranny, but another one in France is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the ways in which speech critical of Israel in France is almost always is more easily and more commonly equated with anti-Semitism than it is here in the United States. That's been a huge issue in France for some pro-Palestinian activists and others. And at the same time in France, as that has been heavily regulated, you also have in France efforts to impinge upon the expression of some Muslim communities in the ways in which they dress with the niqab and other head coverings, another form of clothing as free expression. And so there's no consistency surrounding these things in many of those other countries. The other thing is that in Rwanda and other places, once laws against and banning speech go on the books, and an authoritarian takes power, they have an extremely strong hand. And this is what I say when I think about Trump and the First Amendment in the United States. We haven't really fully digested yet how much the First Amendment protected journalists and those who were critical of Trump from speaking over the past few years. And I think actually, even though Trump simultaneously was saying that he defended the First Amendment and he was the champion of free speech, the truth is that in the courts, there were many decisions where speech critical of Trump was protected. If we didn't have those speech protections, it might not have been.
Thanks. That was really super helpful. I appreciate it.
Yeah,
Yes.
happy to. The book by Nadine Strawson that I mentioned before has a lot of examples like this.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And thank you so much, Sean, for your question. Michelle, would you like to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. Thanks again for the talk. This is great. So this isn't the best thought out question, but I was thinking about when you were talking about so public health issues, right? So the people who tend to be these anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers also tend to align with some of the racist white supremacist talk as well. And so what I've been thinking about is like, how does that misinformation, because you wouldn't say that like those same people probably will still wear seatbelts, which is a public health issue, right? But they're not going to wear masks because, you know, by God, they have the right not to do that or whatever. So how does how do you fight that? Where is that a misinformation thing? Is that a free speech thing? Like those two things got kind of blurred for me in this recent stuff. So I don't know if that's a question or what, but
well, I'll come back to the point because I did say it, and then I was kind of also thinking as I said it, you know, maybe I'm not saying enough about it. Because it is complicated, and we are living through at a time where these issues are really very much coming into a head.
Yeah.
What I would say is that my reflections on this are always going to be about the importance of education and knowledge, public education and public knowledge. And interestingly, this actually fuses with things I used to do before I came to Penn as a professor and as a teacher and as a learner. And my really solid conviction that citizens, people, are not educated in the ways that they could be, and that knowledge is power. And so when I think about misinformation and when I think about unfettered free speech and this point about free speech being a threat to democracy, my answer for me is always going to be that the answer still can't be censorship, because censorship is never going to work as a response. So you have a group of people who wants to say something. How can you inoculate everybody else from what it is that they have to say? The answer cannot be to constantly censor them. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't moments where certainly there's two realms to this, right? Legal and moral or ethical, right? The legal realm is, can Twitter censor Trump? Well, legally, yes, they can. Can a high school kick out a student or expel a student for wearing a shirt pro-drugs? Yes, they can, right? There are many ways in which institutional authorities, both primarily private, though some also public, do have powers to curtail, infringe upon expression. The question is, how much power do we want to give them to do that, whether that's social media, and certainly in the case of the government, how much power do we want them to do that? Because it's not very hard to see how, let's say we empower the government to silence people who are engaging in misinformation. Okay, well, let's say you're allowed to, the government has some power to impede upon people who are critical of the vaccine or spreading misinformation about its effectiveness. Fine. But what happens when there is a whistleblower, an Edward Snowden, another type, who says, actually, I have documents that show that the government is lying to the public about the effectiveness of this vaccine. Now, that's not the case with the COVID vaccines currently, just to be explicitly clear. But in this hypothetical situation, what happens in that case? Well, suddenly the government, who has now a very vested interest perhaps in hiding some kind of cover-up, let's say there is malpractice or the breaking of laws. We would much rather have a society in which those people can do that. So this is the challenge in all of these cases. Number one, any case we have to think about very much in terms of the context, right? So like Trump and his Twitter feed is radically different from a student in a high school. And it is actually, we can have broad principles of free speech and diversity and inclusion, but we really need to think about each case in that way that lawyers do, which is, if you ask a lawyer about something in the abstract, they're always going to answer, well, it depends. Can this person do this? Well, it depends. Can this person get in trouble for doing that? Well, it depends. When did they do it? How did they do it? What did they write beforehand? Did Trump incite an insurrection? Most lawyers, First Amendment lawyers, would start, okay, if you were just ask them in general, it's, well, it depends. I have to understand the facts. So the best that we can do is approximate these broad principles. And in the realm of broad principles, my experience of this realm of free speech is that any time that we strengthen the power of institutions to make these decisions, they make the decisions in politically questionable ways. There's a professor at Auburn University, an adjunct professor, who essentially was demoted from teaching after he criticized the police on Facebook. And the argument really was just that the university said he was engaging in hate speech of police, and therefore he didn't deserve to be at the university anymore. And there's a litany of examples like that, even on other maybe less contentious issues and more contentious issues. But the challenge is, when we think about our principles, our guiding points, we really have to be skeptical that they're going to be solved by empowering more censorship. I would say, if you want to inoculate the population from some set of views, the best thing to do is really invest in public education, in public trust in education, in public knowledge, in literacy, in equality, in justice, in all the things that we've talked about today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question, Michelle. And others, please feel free to add your questions in the chat or raise your hands if there's a question that you would like to pose. And I think while we're waiting for some people to perhaps do that, I would love to ask a question, Jonathan, just to keep the conversation going. One of the great points that you made, I think, is that we always have to think about power dynamics when we think about free speech. And so one of the things that I'm wondering, and I think this was a question that was asked in an earlier session when our keynote speaker Dr. Lori White, who's president of DePaul University, she said that, universities, she would really encourage them to lead with their values when approaching issues of free speech. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts about how to address these power imbalances that might occur around issues of free speech, or how to empower, students, staff, faculty, graduate students, to sort of raise concerns that they might have in a way that is acknowledging, if there's instances of hate speech, and sort of addressing those issues that may have occurred.
Well, that's a great question. No doubt we have seen students, grad students, many students take a much more active stance in trying to point out these inequities, whether it's students of color at elite institutions or elsewhere saying, I have a history, an experience of being made to feel marginalized here, or whether it is faculty of color. Last summer, there was a huge movement of faculty talking about experiences of racism at their universities or previous universities that poured out on Twitter under the hashtag Black in the I think it was Black in the Ivy, the question is then, well, how do universities respond? How can they respond? One of the things that many universities set up are what called bias response teams, or offices to intake and record these experiences of students. And I think that makes a great deal of sense. But they have to be very careful in where those offices have been empowered to conduct pseudo investigations, where they have the power to dole out punishments, where there are serious questions about due process. It is extremely easy. It's actually almost far too easy for people when they speak to be misinterpreted, and for the normal affordances that we all have for, oh, I misspoke, or I wish I had said that differently, can you forgive me, that exist between two individuals, don't exist between faculty and students in the same way. They certainly don't exist on Zoom in the same way, and they don't exist like in a large lecture hall in the same way. And so the question for those teams or for universities is, how can they engage in education? How can they engage in training? How can they engage in research or data collection? But how can they pause before engaging in punishment or censorship or or processes? It's kind of a funny thing to say, processes that don't have due process. And so the challenge around that is to be really careful in how we're creating these bodies and the powers that we give them. It doesn't mean they don't or can't exist in some form. And as to students and as to universities, I think making really clear to incoming students their rights to free speech and their rights to be to an inclusive, equitable educational experience. They have both rights, and there are situations that are going to be thorny. I think the real challenge, actually, after years of doing this work, is the expectation from everyone that these things have simple solutions, and they don't. I would urge universities to be upfront with the students about, look, when they come in, like, free speech is a tough thing, and sometimes it's really difficult to know what people said, and sometimes the bar for evidence is really high, but here's why. And I think that if more young people understood the history of some of the things that I'm talking about today, then maybe they might come to understand why it is that institutions act this way. Now, just because an institution doesn't fire a professor who said something hateful or offensive doesn't mean that students can't organize around it, or engage in teach-ins, or find other modes of expression. And I do think that there is an onus on universities, even in situations where they don't dismiss someone, a professor or someone else, that they could still speak about it. And that has been a real challenge for some universities. I remember one a few years ago. There were supremacist flyers put up on campus, and the university put out a statement that said, we have white supremacist flyers on campus, and we're reminding you that you can't use double-sided tape on the walls in that building. And that was the gist of their statement. They said nothing about the content of the flyers involved. And of course, people were offended and said, well, why aren't you speaking out to condemn this? And I think that's a responsibility that universities have, which is, again, kind of coming back to what I was saying before about the marketplace of ideas and supporting free speech and DEI together, is that you can't actually that universities can support free speech, but they can also use their voice. They can use their bully pulpit. They can use their reach, and there's lots that they can do to invest in educational programs and resources for students and for their communities to understand these issues better.
Definitely, thank you, and thank you. I think especially for those, applied sort of tips, in investing in programming and providing spaces to have these discussions. I think that's really important, because it's true. Even as a student before I became a graduate student, as an undergraduate, I used to think that things could be solved quickly, and the more I become involved in education and the more I learn, that's not usually the case. So it's like understanding these processes, and having that information is really important. So thank you for that. I don't know if others would like to pose any questions to Jonathan, or if you, I see that you put up a slide of what can institutions do, which is always really helpful, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just refreshing it for you and others. And I think actually, universities are tremendously well resourced in terms of their staff and personnel, but they are so siloed and so large. I mean, any university is essentially a city that they are often it's difficult for them to figure out how to work. We have these domains of university operations that don't speak to one another. But just as an example of being creative around it, one of the things that I have found is that people who work in residence life almost always have encountered and have years of experience encountering challenges around speech, because that's what they do. That's what they've been trained to do, is mediate conflict. And yet their expertise isn't academic expertise in a sense. And so it's not really recognized or utilized beyond the residence halls. So you don't see, a university-wide effort to sponsor, dialogue or education about, difficult dialogue and how do people talk to each other across difference, sponsored by, using residence life folks outside of their domain. That's where they do their domain. Similarly, on many campuses, I've been to campuses where university leaders are struggling to figure out how to respond to controversies in the realm of free speech and DEI, and don't know that in their law school or in their education school, they have people who are viewed as national experts on those issues. And that's not who they turn to for help because of the siloing. And so there's a lot of opportunity in universities, and particularly at the intersection of university and community, to be thinking about how the university uses its component parts in new ways.
No, definitely. I think that's really informative and really helpful. And I don't know if you could speak a little bit to how you might suggest that universities go about, identifying all these great resources, because it's very true. Sometimes departments, you might not know exactly what everybody else is doing, and it can be more difficult the further you get into a university's framework. But I don't know if you have any thoughts, given your experience, with how universities can go about sort of identifying potential resources, around free speech and freedom of expression and things like that they might be able to tap into, when situations arise, or just generally to develop programming.
A lot of these things are run by committees, and committees are a good way to do that sort of thing. Taking people to bringing people together from different walks of the university in one place. But really, the best universities are learning universities that are trying to have more town halls, are trying to have more opportunities for different parts of the university to talk to each other and learn about each other's work. I think the word I like to use in a lot of residence halls, and certainly in the pandemic, is one of reverberation. The events on campuses involving, controversial speakers, involving student protests, involving hate, these have really powerful reverberations in students and faculty's lives. And I think whether it's even happened on your campus, or whether in your case if it's at Merced or somewhere else in the system, these things are reverberating. And the national political moment, it has reverberated over the past few years. And so finding opportunities to bring people together to talk about and process almost that reverberation is really necessary. And there are numerous organizations, Penn included, that are trying to help universities do that. And I think I think that we've seen a lot of criticism, in particular of diversity work, that often isn't actually based in paying particular attention to precise modes of, diversity workshops or engagements. It's just this kind of broad stroke criticism. And, there's actually a ton of stuff out there that wouldn't fit wouldn't really be subject to those kinds of criticisms, but a lot of people are very dismissive. So I think just in general in this polarized moment, the more that we can get everybody talking to each other, and I don't just mean across left and right, I mean across all parts of universities, it will be for the better.
Oh, thank you so much for those, I think, sage thoughts, but it's very true. Communication is key, especially in remote environments, right, where we might miss that before. Well, you would have those hallway conversations with someone or something else. Just having communication is really important. So thank you so much for sharing that, Jonathan. And thank you for your fantastic presentation, and to our audience for the questions that were submitted. Before we end today's session, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my colleague, Ornar Primitivo. So if you all join me in sharing a virtual clap for our fantastic speaker, before we turn it over to Ornar, who will do our closing remarks, that would be fantastic. Thank you. All right, Ornar, would you like to go ahead?
Yes. Great. And again, thank you, Jonathan, for joining us today. Just a lot of stuff that I've been taking notes on, especially this is our inaugural free speech at UC Merced, and we can only grow and really, share this information and how we better serve our communities here in Merced, and hopefully that we are the pebble that hits the water, right? Like that's where the ripple effect, and that we always stay in community around these specific topics, especially hard topics that's causing harm, but grounding us in community. So again, thank you for joining us today. We will go to the next section to close us out, but also just let you know we still have a couple more events. Check out the website that Maria just posted. And for also specifically, just want to put some emphasis on the Friday events and description. If you all want to check that out, I'll leave the exploration on your own. It's going to be a good one. So yeah, again, thank you, Jonathan, for this great opportunity to share your information and to work with PEN America, and of course the UC Free Speech Center and Civic Engagement for the funding. And yeah. So
thank you so much. And thanks for being here. And if anyone is interested in talking to me more about these issues, I'm going to put my email in the chat as well. I love talking to people on campuses about these issues. There's always a new one and always a thorny one, and happy to try and help you puzzle through them anytime.
Very true. Thank you so much. And before we start our giveaway, which we have traditionally in our inaugural Free Speech Week used to close our sessions, I would also encourage everybody who would like to provide any feedback that they might have to complete our feedback survey link, which I included in the chat, and we'll share in a follow-up email after today's event. And